Most people spend years waiting for someone to prove their loyalty completely, unconditionally, without any self-interest attached. This wait rarely ends the way they hope, not because people are cruel or dishonest, but because human nature runs on interest, circumstance, and convenience far more than most people want to admit. Understanding this does not have to leave you bitter or alone. It can actually free you from a kind of disappointment that relationships were never designed to prevent in the first place. Why loyalty shifts with circumstance, not character. Most people assume loyalty is a fixed trait, something a person either has or doesn't have consistently, no matter the situation. In reality, loyalty is far more fluid than most people want to accept. It shifts based on convenience, personal benefit, and changing circumstances, even among people who genuinely care about you. This doesn't mean every relationship is fake. It means loyalty, like most human behavior, responds to context rather than existing as some unchanging constant. Psychologists studying social behavior have consistently found that alliances and friendships shift based on circumstance far more often than people expect or want to believe. Those who assume loyalty is permanent and unconditional are repeatedly surprised when circumstances change, and the same people who once seemed entirely devoted suddenly prioritize their own interests instead. This isn't necessarily betrayal in the dramatic sense. It's human nature responding to new information and new incentives. Think about friendships that feel unbreakable during a specific season of life: high school, a first job, a shared struggle, only to fade naturally once circumstances change. This fading rarely comes from malice. It comes from the reality that many friendships are sustained by proximity and shared context rather than an unconditional commitment that exists independent of circumstance. When the circumstance changes, so does the relationship, regardless of how genuine the connection once felt. Why this hits different for a generation raised on constant connection. This reality lands especially hard for anyone who grew up with a phone in their hand, watching curated versions of everyone else's friendships online, believing that real loyalty looks like matching group chats and daily check-ins. Social media has created an illusion that connection should be constant and effortless, which makes the natural ebb and flow of real relationships feel like personal rejection rather than normal human behavior. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from measuring your real relationships against a highlight reel that was never actually representative of anyone's full reality. The friend group that looks inseparable online is still, underneath it all, made up of individual people making individual decisions based on their own interests and circumstances, exactly like everyone else. Recognizing this doesn't mean assuming everyone online is faking their friendships. It means understanding that visibility and depth are not the same thing, and loyalty was never something that could be measured by how often someone comments on your posts. Why expecting perfect loyalty sets you up for repeated disappointment. The expectation of perfect, unconditional loyalty creates a specific kind of vulnerability, repeated disappointment whenever reality fails to match this expectation. Because loyalty is naturally circumstantial rather than absolute, expecting otherwise means you will almost inevitably experience situations that feel like betrayal, even when the other person's behavior reflects entirely normal human patterns rather than genuine malice. Understanding human nature realistically rather than idealistically protects you from this repeated disappointment. This understanding doesn't require cynicism or the assumption that everyone will eventually betray you. It requires recognizing that most people, most of the time, will prioritize their own interests when those interests genuinely conflict with loyalty to you, and this pattern reflects normal human behavior rather than a personal flaw specific to the people in your life. Consider someone who expects a close friend to always take their side in every disagreement, regardless of context or fairness. When this friend occasionally sees merit in another perspective, or simply avoids taking sides in a conflict that doesn't directly involve them. The first person often experiences this as a profound betrayal. In reality, the friend's behavior reflects reasonable, balanced judgment rather than disloyalty. The disappointment comes not from the friend's actual behavior, but from an unrealistic expectation that was never going to be consistently met. Why this understanding should not lead to isolation, recognizing that loyalty is circumstantial rather than absolute, does not mean withdrawing from relationships entirely or assuming everyone is fundamentally untrustworthy. This misunderstanding leads to a different kind of problem: isolation driven by excessive cynicism, which creates its own form of suffering separate from the disappointment of misplaced expectation. The goal is not to trust no one. It is to trust appropriately, understanding the natural limits that shape even genuine relationships. Wisdom in relationships involves neither naive idealism nor excessive cynicism, but rather realistic understanding of how loyalty actually functions. This understanding allows you to maintain meaningful relationships while protecting yourself from the specific disappointment that comes from expecting a level of unconditional loyalty that rarely exists consistently, even among people who genuinely care about you. This means recognizing that most relationships involve a combination of genuine care and self-interest simultaneously, rather than existing purely as one or the other. A friend can genuinely care about your well-being while also prioritizing their own interests when those interests conflict directly with supporting you in a specific situation. Both things can be true at once, and accepting this combination allows for more realistic, sustainable relationships than expecting purely selfless loyalty that few people can consistently provide. Why self-reliance becomes essential. Once you accept this reality, you release the expectation of perfect unconditional loyalty from others, a specific shift becomes necessary. Developing genuine self-reliance rather than depending entirely on others to validate your worth or support your decisions unconditionally. This self-reliance doesn't mean rejecting relationships or support from others. It means building an internal foundation strong enough that disappointment from others, when it inevitably occurs, doesn't destabilize your fundamental sense of security or worth. This kind of resilience comes from an ability to rely primarily on your own judgment, resources, and internal stability rather than depending entirely on the consistent loyalty of others. Self-reliance protects you from the kind of devastating disappointment that comes from placing your entire sense of security in relationships that were never designed to provide unconditional, permanent support regardless of circumstance. This shift requires developing your own internal resources, your own capacity for self-support, and your own ability to make decisions and navigate challenges without depending entirely on others to validate or support you unconditionally. This doesn't mean becoming isolated or refusing help when genuinely offered. It means ensuring that your fundamental stability doesn't depend entirely on receiving that help consistently from any single source. Why building something of your own matters more than being chosen. There's a specific kind of motivation that comes from this realization, one that shifts your focus away from constantly seeking validation from a friend group, a partner, or a following, and toward building something that exists independent of whether anyone else shows up for you consistently. Skills, discipline, financial independence, physical health, none of these require anyone else's loyalty to remain intact. They belong entirely to you, regardless of who stays and who eventually prioritizes their own path instead. This is not about becoming detached from people or pretending relationships don't matter. It's about recognizing that a life built entirely around being chosen by others is inherently unstable, while a life built around your own growth and capability remains steady regardless of who comes and goes. The people who end up with both genuine relationships and personal stability are usually the ones who built the stability first, rather than waiting for relationships to provide it for them. Why this realistic view actually improves your relationships paradoxically. Releasing the expectation of perfect loyalty often improves the quality of your actual relationships rather than diminishing them. When you no longer expect unconditional, circumstance-independent loyalty, you stop experiencing repeated disappointment when normal human behavior, prioritizing self-interest in specific situations, occurs naturally. This removes a significant source of resentment and conflict that often develops when expectations consistently exceed what relationships can realistically provide. Relationships built on realistic understanding tend to be more stable and sustainable than those built on idealistic expectations that inevitably lead to disappointment. When you accept that friends and family will sometimes prioritize their own interests, you can appreciate genuine moments of support and loyalty more fully without the constant undercurrent of disappointment that comes from expecting a perfection that was never realistically achievable. This realistic understanding also allows you to identify genuine patterns of care more accurately, distinguishing between people who consistently show up in meaningful ways even while also prioritizing their own interests appropriately, versus those whose behavior reflects a genuine absence of care or respect. This distinction becomes clearer once you stop measuring relationships against an impossible standard of unconditional circumstance-independent loyalty that few people can consistently provide. How to identify genuine care within realistic limitations, understanding that perfect loyalty rarely exists, doesn't mean all relationships are equally valuable or equally trustworthy. It means developing a more nuanced framework for evaluating relationships, one based on consistent patterns of genuine care within realistic human limitations, rather than expecting an idealized standard that ignores the reality of how loyalty actually functions. This framework involves observing whether someone consistently shows up in meaningful ways over time, even while acknowledging that they will sometimes prioritize their own interests in specific situations. It involves recognizing the difference between someone who occasionally can't support you due to legitimate competing circumstances versus someone whose pattern consistently reflects self-interest at your expense, regardless of the actual stakes involved. Genuine relationships, even within realistic human limitations, still demonstrate consistent patterns of mutual respect, support during significant moments, and honest communication, even when this support can't be unconditional or completely independent of circumstance. Learning to recognize this pattern, rather than expecting flawless, circumstance-independent loyalty, allows you to invest appropriately in relationships that genuinely deserve your trust and continued effort. Why this understanding ultimately creates freedom. The deepest benefit of accepting that perfect, unconditional loyalty rarely exists comes not from protecting yourself against disappointment alone, but from the genuine freedom this understanding provides. When you stop expecting others to consistently prioritize your interests above their own in every circumstance, you release a significant burden both from yourself and from the people in your life who were never able to meet this unrealistic standard in the first place. This freedom allows you to engage with relationships more authentically, appreciating genuine moments of support and connection without the underlying anxiety that comes from expecting a perfection that rarely exists. It allows you to extend appropriate understanding when others prioritize their own interests in specific situations, recognizing this as normal human behavior rather than personal betrayal that requires an emotional reaction. This doesn't mean tolerating genuine mistreatment or accepting relationships that consistently fail to provide basic respect and consideration. It means distinguishing between the normal, circumstantial nature of loyalty and genuine patterns of disrespect or exploitation that deserve a different response entirely. Understanding this distinction allows you to maintain appropriate boundaries while releasing unrealistic expectations that were never serving your well-being in the first place. Understanding that no one owes you perfect, unconditional loyalty was never meant to leave you isolated, bitter, or unable to trust anyone genuinely. It was meant to free you from a specific kind of disappointment that comes from expecting something human nature rarely provides consistently, regardless of how much someone genuinely cares about you. Once you accept this reality, you can build self-reliance that protects your fundamental stability. Appreciate genuine moments of support more fully without constant underlying anxiety, and develop relationships based on realistic understanding rather than idealistic expectation. This shift, uncomfortable as it may initially feel, ultimately creates the foundation for both greater self-sufficiency and more sustainable, authentic relationships built on what real connection can actually provide rather than what you once believed it should.